Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. Before we get started, I would just ask you to silence your phones if you haven't already. I am Karthik Ramakrishnan, the Associate Dean for the School of Public Policy. You'll hear a lot more about the research that I do shortly because I'll be one of the panelists in the first panel. But what I do now is to welcome you to UC Riverside and to the School of Public Policy. This is a historic building. It's one of the earliest buildings for the University of California, Riverside, which is the barn. And our School of Public Policy is on the other side of campus. So it's not quite an SPP venue right here. But thank you all for coming for this very important conversation, which is immigration in the IE, state and local policy perspectives. Given some of the recent policy developments, not only at the national level, but at the state level, it's a very opportune time to be having this conversation. We are honored to co-sponsor this event today with the Public Policy Institute of California, with support from the California Endowment. In previous years, we've been proud to co-host these events with PPIC. Last year, we had an event on political participation, youth engagement, and racial disparities right before the presidential election. And in prior years, we've also co-hosted events on the demographic and economic future of the Inland Empire, as well as environmental policy and climate change. So we're excited again to partner with PPIC. I should note that I'm an adjunct fellow of PPIC and a former employee of PPIC. We also have someone who is a summer intern at PPIC who is in our MPP program. So the connections go very deep, and it's, I think, a very fruitful partnership. So it's just great to be able to partner again. It's also an important moment, I think, for PPIC, which is the foremost think tank in the state of California, to come to our region and to hear about the kind of perspectives that we'll hear from today, especially in our second panel. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the School of Public Policy, we're all about solutions for the region, solutions for the world. So these are our new marketing talking points that I'm going to go over with you here. No, this is, it's been exciting. We're in our third year in terms of the MPP program. Fourth year, I believe, we're entering in our fourth year of the establishment of this school. And it's a really exciting time and a place to be doing this kind of work, not only with respect to our student population, but also with our community partners. And one small, exciting announcement I'll make is that the School of Public Policy just recently got a significant grant from the James Irvine Foundation to do community engaged work through a Center for Social Innovation, to do the kind of work that we're already doing here, making sure that when we have panels on topics, it's not just academic experts kind of speaking out to an audience, but integrating academic research with community expertise. And there's a lot more that we'll have to say in the future, but it's really exciting to have SPP as the kind of home. Many people are now starting to think of us as an anchor institution in the region that does policy-relevant work, but that can be a force for good in the region to make sure the kind of public policies that we're considering are informed by evidence, but also that community stakeholders can develop new tools and vocabulary and connections when it comes to having policy impact. So thank you for joining us. I think this is one of our first major events of the year, and we look forward to engaging with you in future such events. We're particularly excited this evening to be part of this discussion on immigration. We have a lot of faculty expertise. You'll hear soon from Professor Cecilia Ayllón, but we have many other faculty in the School of Public Policy and more broadly in the University of California, Riverside, that focus on issues related to immigration, immigrant integration, immigrant empowerment, and the like. Just to give you a preview of the setup for today, first we'll have a conversation between Mark Baldessari and myself. Initially thought we'd have a moderated conversation, but we're going to try like the buddy routine today. So we'll see how that goes. Mark is going to be presenting some data, recent as well as ongoing and historical data from PPIC when it comes to immigration-related issues. After that, we'll have a moderated panel and this will be moderated by Margarita Luna from the California Endowment. And in the panel, we'll have one of our faculty members, excuse me, one of our faculty members, Cecilia Ayon, who I just mentioned, as well as Johnson Pham of UC Riverside. He's a student and in Asian Pacific student programs. We'll also have Luz Gallegos from TODAC Legal Center, Diani Murillo from IEIYC, and then we'll have a Q&A at the conclusion of that as well. One thing I forgot to mention, after Mark and I do our routine, we're going to have a brief Q&A, and then we'll have the panel, and then a Q&A following that. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and one of the foremost thinkers when it comes to public policy in California, Mark Baldessari, president of Ppic. So I think we're going to start with you laying the landscape of public opinion as it involves immigrants and immigration.
First, let me just say that I'm here to listen and learn as much as to inform you. I'm really anxious to hear from the panel, hear from Karthik, hear from all of you about the experience of immigrants and immigration policy in the Inland Empire. So it's a privilege to be here, and it's an honor to share this moment with you, Karthik. We've had, our institute's 23 years old, and we've had a long history of interest in immigration in California. And it really starts with the fact that the immigrant population in California and California itself they're so intertwined. California is home to more than 10 million immigrants, more than a quarter of the state's population. Several counties have populations of 30% or more foreign-born population. So there's just no way of separating out the immigrant population from the quality of life, the economy, the history, the politics, and the future of California. So it's really a central topic for us. And obviously, in the last year, the attention to the undocumented population that has been an ongoing discussion at the federal level, now with the stakes being raised in terms of the new administration, we've become even more interested in the topic. Just to put the undocumented population in California in perspective, we're talking about probably 2.6 million population. I looked at some of the latest figures that we had, and they're not that recent, but about 250,000 undocumented immigrants in the Riverside, San Bernardino area. Does that number sound about right to you? So these are significant numbers. Let me talk a little bit about public opinion, and then I want to ask Karthik a question. When Karthik and I were together about 5 weeks ago in Los Angeles, we had our board of directors met in Los Angeles. We had a dinner. I asked Karthik to be part of a discussion around immigration, and for that conversation, I went and looked at all the numbers and public opinion numbers that we've collected in Los Angeles and statewide and compared those. On the way up today on the airplane, I was looking at the numbers for the Inland Empire from our recent surveys. And I'm going to just give you a few numbers from our survey, Karthik, and maybe you can,
this is great.
speak
it's like
to them.
Hot off the press.
Okay, yeah. So in the survey that we just released, I asked three questions on immigration, and then a couple of questions on political and racial divisions, and then some on civic participation. There's a question which we've been asking since the early 2000s, which is taken from a national question, and it asks, are immigrants a benefit to California, or are immigrants a burden to California? And in our latest survey, we saw a record number of Californians, 76% say that immigrants are a benefit to California. Now that number was actually a little bit higher in Los Angeles, a little bit lower in the Inland Empire, 63% in the Inland Empire. But that's still a very significant number, and just sort of an overwhelming sentiment in California that immigrants are a benefit. And all the politics on the topic really flow from that general attitude. So I'm going to stop there and ask you, what do you think about that?
That's interesting. So of course, if you compare us to Los Angeles County, I think on this and other measures, we'll be less progressive, if you want to kind of use that kind of general framework. But that 63%, I would say, is a big change. So I came to Riverside in 2005, right? And I remember, this was back when you had, even now you certainly have a fair amount of federal enforcement activity, but you had a lot of cooperation between local governments and Border Patrol, local governments and ICE. And the climate was one that was still quite dicey, and I would say, of course, there still are pockets in the region that are quite hostile to immigrants and undocumented immigrants in particular, but even just more generally, brown people. I would say sometimes it's hard to separate out what is it about immigration as opposed to race here. But that 63% figure is, even though it's not as high as LA, it's encouraging to me. I think it's in line with broader patterns that we're seeing. Part of it is a demographic shift in the region, right? So now this region is now majority Latino, and so it's that, but it's not just about demographics. I think you're right. There is a broad shift in the center of gravity in California in terms of it's amazing, right? And I mentioned this in that PPIC event, that it was only 20 years ago, right, that we still, Prop 227 was passed in 1998, right? So the kind of culture warfare and the politics of targeting immigrants and Latinos in particular is not that far back. And if we stretch our history from the founding of the California Republic until, I would say probably starting in 2001, 2002, California was a pioneer of anti-immigrant laws, statewide, but even more locally. So, and some of the kind of more prominent anti-immigrant actions involving Riverside was when they burned the Chinatown down. Right, so a lot of anti-Asian sentiment was very much a part of California's history in the 19th century. So it's remarkable. I think we just take it for granted now. But even in this region 10 years ago, we would not be having a conversation like this.
I agree. So when we met about 5 weeks ago, the news about the changes in the DACA program were breaking, and everybody was trying to figure that out. And I was trying to figure out how to ask a question about it in a public opinion survey in California, because we'd never done that. So we asked the question, thinking about undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children, do you favor or oppose the protections given by DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which include protections from deportation and a work permit? And 78% of Californians said that they were in favor of DACA protections, since a number of the national polls have also found very strong support, and 70% in the Inland Empire, so not that different, 70%. When something gets to 70% in our surveys, we call that overwhelming majority. We have certain things that trigger certain words, and that's an overwhelming majority. What do you make of that?
That again is also, I guess there's no secret where I stand on some of these issues. In general, I'm actually, when it comes to partisanship, and this is something that actually when I came to PPIC, I think a fair number of the fellows were, at the time, declined to state, but no party preference, because, I run surveys too, and I don't want anyone to kind of question my partisan leanings and commitments, but I would say on immigration, it's pretty clear where my issue commitments are. So I find that to be very encouraging. One thing I'll mention, and I'll highlight some research that Jen Marola is not here. She's a professor here at UC Riverside. Jen Marola and I, and a former grad student who's now a professor, we wrote this book called Framing Immigrants that came out last year. Actually, I'll put a plug. It's still relevant, in fact, to this DACA question. Because what we found is the conservative attempt to try to reduce support for immigration, pro-immigrant policies by calling things amnesty actually does work. Mm-hmm. So we ran a bunch of survey experiments, and it was very consistent that whenever they use the word amnesty, that it would reduce support. But we also found that using the child frame was very powerful, right? So and we've seen this not even recently, so after the 2012 election, right? So you had Paul Ryan, you even had Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly saying that we got to do something for the kids, right? And so there's something there that I think is very powerful. Now, within the immigrant rights movement itself, I think there's some ambivalence because they know, I should say we, because I'm an immigrant myself, but immigrant activists know that it's a powerful frame, but it's also a limited frame because then what do you do about everyone else? But now I think we're in a pretty dire situation where, some of the immigrant activists and nonprofit leaders in this region are documented themselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, if we don't find a solution to this, it's going to cause a lot of chaos.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense. This issue, I'm a little cautious thinking about it from the policy side, though. Mm-hmm. Think whatever, it wasn't even a honeymoon, but whatever dinner conversation that the president had with Schumer and Pelosi, we're already moving now to a new set of conditions on family visas, on legal migration, not recognizing that if you cut back on the number of family visas, you're actually going to make the undocumented problem even worse going into the future. My concern is that pro-immigrant advocates and Democrats might be walking into a trap come March. Because if the alternative is chaos and choosing a bill that has some very undesirable elements in it, but allows people to continue working, I'm not sure what choice pro-immigrant advocates will have.
Yeah. We didn't ask in this survey, probably we'll in our next survey at the end of the year, but generally about 85% of Californians say that they favor a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So that number has been pretty standard, and majorities across partisan groups, strong majorities across partisan groups, even Republicans, as well as Democrats, even Trump supporters, saying that they favor a path to legal citizenship. That's been pretty standard. I wanted to get your take because you are somebody who follows both immigration as well as the political and racial divisions that are occurring in the country now. And we repeated a question from the Pew Research Center, in which we found that 49% in California wide and 46% in the Inland Empire said that race relations have become worse in the last year. However, we added another question and said, have race relations become worse in California? And in both California and the Inland Empire, almost the same answers. 31% said that race relations had become worse. More people said that they had stayed the same. What's your sense of what's going on in terms of race relations?
And I see that you wrote down some of these things, so I don't know if you have any racial breakdowns, if there was a difference in opinions among whites versus non-whites. But I'd be curious on that. But yeah, I want to come back to you too, Mark, because Mark is too modest. Mark has been an observer of California public opinion for a long time now, and so I'm going to throw this question back at him once I'm done with it.
Well, I think we're in a bit of a bubble in California for race relations.
But given that historical thing, when I mean, you were in Orange County doing
Right.
doing research. I mean, especially I think of Orange County as kind of
In the
the
80s.
heart of the kind
Right.
of conservative, anti-immigrant activism movement, right?
Right.
But I think even Orange County, I don't know if you have Orange County data, but I imagine even Orange County has shifted.
Yeah,
on
Orange
this.
County has shifted also, and it's just, the whole state has an acceptance for immigrants and more generally for racial diversity that compared to the nation.
Right.
And it has to do with how people, who's in their social networks, how they relate to people at work and in their communities, and we have twice as high a percent as the nation as a whole of foreign-born population in California. And so over time, that really has a moderating effect on attitudes. So, race relations in the nation probably have become more tense in the last year.
Right.
They may become more tense in California as a result of what's going on in the nation as a whole. But for the time being, I think people are feeling that, we're in a bubble, we're in a unique or different situation. I know that you're an expert on civic engagement and political participation, and so knowing that I was going to be here, I purposely asked a few questions.
Sure.
Because other times you've also said, Mark, you don't ask questions
Oh yeah,
about
no,
this.
no. I mean, I'll give a
okay.
different take, and this is actually interesting,
Yeah.
Mark, because Mark is
Yeah.
he's formerly from the UC system, and he's a sociologist by training,
Yep.
and I think the answer that he gave is very much in line with the kind of sociological explanation. So I'm a political scientist by training, right? So mine would have a more of a kind of political angle to
Yeah.
this, and I
Okay.
think they're consistent, right? I mean. So basically, what California has shown, I mean, other parts of the country are going through this, although I've pushed back hard against this notion that diversity or diversification itself is a problem. It does create opportunities for scapegoating and demagoguery, and we're seeing that play out at the national level, right, in spades. But California went through those moments in the 80s and 90s, right? So it was a period in which Latinos were present in the population, but they didn't yet have the voting numbers. And so if you think of all those racially conservative propositions, it's kind of the last roar of racial conservatism.
Yeah.
Now, someone could say, well, the country is going to become majority minority by 2050, so maybe, first of all, 2050 is a long way away.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a long way.
And also remember that we live in a system of federalism.
Yeah.
So if we were just, everyone was just, first of all, if everyone was an adult citizen and voting on a referendum nationally, then you could say maybe then people of color will have enough power that they can beat it back. But we live in a system of federalism. I would hate to think that most other states are going to have to go through the pains that California went through. I really hope that we are beyond that. And I think we are, but it does take a certain amount of leadership. I'll also point to Arizona as an example, right? So Professor Ayón comes from Arizona, and people have talked about Arizona and even Texas as places that will go through what California went through. I'm not so sure, and this is where politics comes into play. So Arizona has passed legislation that makes it very difficult for people to prove their ability to, their qualification to vote in state elections. Chris Kobach, who's been one of the leading advocates of restrictionist or anti-immigrant state legislation, is also, he's now on this presidential commission investigating the supposedly millions of illegal votes that mysteriously exist somewhere in space. But there are states that are doing everything possible to prevent people of color from gaining political power.
Right.
So I think even this story that we've seen in California, it's not just about, certainly when you look at the growth of the Latino caucus and API electeds and the electorate, that California would not tolerate something like this the way it did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But that's good. But even white voters, from all the data I've seen, they've also kind of mellowed
Shifted.
out, as it were.
They've shifted.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is politics. I think a lot of people looked at what California did and what Pete Wilson did and thought, the Growth and Opportunity Project, which was the autopsy of the 2012 election, was that the National Republican Party should not follow California's path.
Right.
And that's a path to disaster. But Trump proved them all wrong.
Yeah.
And I think the question still remains, is this the last dying gasp of a failed strategy? Or are we going to see more and more people at the state level trying a Trump strategy in many of these
Right.
states? And I think it's still early to tell.
Yeah. And part of it depends on what type of political mobilization in response to this last election that we see. And so I wanted to, you're the political scientist, I'm the public opinion person on this. But obviously you mentioned the efforts at vote suppression. We also, and I saw this in the last survey, we have a situation in which because of the Russian meddling in the last election, it's reduced people's confidence in the election process, which could have implications for how many people vote in the next election and how many people feel their vote it's worthwhile to vote, particularly if they're not regular voters. And I've been talking to our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, about this quite a bit. But I wanted to give you some indications from our polling in California and in the Inland Empire about some of the political reactions. So we found that 51% of Californians, the same 51% for the Inland Empire, said that they're paying more attention to news about politics today than they did before the election. What do you think about that?
Well, are they going to translate it into action? We'll
Okay.
see.
All
And
right.
it's probably mostly national politics that they're paying
Yeah.
attention to.
So I've been very interested in, every time I go to Washington, which I go a few times a year, I was there last week, meeting with the members of our congressional delegation. They've been really impressed with how many people have been showing up at town halls and how much interest there is in communities to come out and talk about healthcare and immigration and other topics. So we asked the question, are you more interested in town halls than you were a year ago? And here, more people in the state than in the Inland Empire saying that they were more interested in town halls. We also asked a question about, have you actually participated in a protest or gone out in some kind of organized political, and the rate is about half in the Inland Empire as it was statewide.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Mark and I co-authored a piece
Yeah.
that's still cited
Yeah.
by people on civic participation, kind of going beyond voting to look at different types of political and civic participation. So I'm so glad to see these questions again. And yeah, it makes sense to me given, first of all, given especially the progressive infrastructure in places like, this population weighted, right? So counties like Los Angeles and Bay Area counties would count more, even though the Inland Empire is growing in size. So it makes sense to me given the comparatively newer, and I'll just be real, weaker progressive infrastructure here compared to what you would see in the coastal
Well, and
counties.
it seems like this is one of the activities, not necessarily getting people out to protest, but getting them more engaged in political issues in their communities that you're going to be working on at the School of Public Policy. And it just looking at that, I saw where the need was, and looking at some of the comparisons by county of voter participation, often the numbers are lower in Riverside, San Bernardino, and actually in Fresno and a couple of other counties in the Central Valley than we see, in, let's say, the Bay Area. It's low in Los Angeles too, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Now,
what
I'm losing track of time, so I don't know if Mark is here, but someone can Mark is outside, I think. So anyway, we'll run for a few more minutes and then we'll head into Q&A. But yeah, no, I mean, I think part of the challenge, and so.
So I guess my question is what's going on in immigration going to turn into people becoming more politically active in the Inland Empire?
So we saw quite a bit of and I think we'll hear more in the second panel. So particularly when it comes to enforcement, and especially with respect to sheriff's departments, in San Bernardino County in particular, but I think even in Riverside County, there's not only anxiety, but people are getting activated and mobilized. Becomes a little dicey when you're talking about countywide elections, especially for local offices like the sheriff, where I think kind of pro-immigrant right activists and just progressives in general don't have as much voting clout as conservatives do for these low salience, low turnout offices.
Yeah.
But maybe that could change, right? If you have a very motivated population that typically does not turn out for these types of elections,
Right.
or cast a valid vote in these elections, maybe it'll be different this time around.
Yeah.
I think it's certainly worth seeing. But more generally, I mean, I think this is part of the puzzle when we think about California has tried to make it as easy as possible for people to participate. And yet our participation rates are lower than many other states in the country. So I think at some point we have to turn it around and not just focus on the cost side of the equation, but on the motivation.
Yeah.
And people, this is something we will be working on here, is to think about local participation, because often, you have local elections that are off cycle. I mean, this is research that PPIC pioneered a while ago. So hopefully pushes to time them with general elections will make a difference, and trying to get people more engaged.
This could be a moment where you've got large numbers of people feeling the country should be going in a certain direction with immigration, that it's not paying attention, and then the question becomes, how does that become translated into voting and other types of political participation?
One thing that I think will be very interesting to watch is the U.S. Senate race on this. Because Senator Feinstein has not, to say that she's moderate on immigration, she's moderate on immigration maybe as far as the country is concerned, but many in California think she's too conservative on immigration. So it'll be, and so with Pro Tem Kevin De Leon announcing that he's going to be challenging Feinstein, especially on an issue like sanctuary cities and so-called sanctuary state for California, it will be a big issue. That's certainly an area of contrast between those two candidates. One final thing I'll say, Mark, when we look at not only attitudes in California about race relations improving, but also support for all of these policies, I think what we're seeing now post-2016 election is a heightened identity of what it means to be a Californian, right? And this is something that I've been talking with colleagues at the California Endowment, people like Manuel Pastor, that we really need to provide more kind of intellectual heft to what this means, that it's not just a knee-jerk resistance, it's actually a positive vision of who we are, right? And I think that's a very hopeful moment. One small piece of this that a former grad student and I are working on, and I think I'd mentioned this at the PPIC event, is this notion of state citizenship, right? And I think at least we're going to do our part of building up that intellectual scaffolding. This is not to say that we're seceding from the U.S., even though many people may want to do that, but it's to say that political membership is not just meaningful at the national level. Many people in California already recognize this, even under the Obama administration, which did a lot of immigration enforcement in ways that were against a lot of the values that Californians held dear. But now it's very clear that we have a particular vision of a society, and I think even of a political community that is very much at odds at the national level, but I think we should actually pause and kind of think about what it means in a positive light rather than just as a reaction. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I agree, and it's an issue for immigration. It's also an issue for climate change. It's an issue for health care. It's an issue for marijuana legalization. So there are a lot of very sharp distinctions now that I think it is time to define in a positive sense and not in a reactive sense what it means to be a Californian.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark. I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions, and then we'll move to the next panel.
Thank you.
And if not, we can move on. Yes, please come up to the microphone and introduce yourselves and ask the question.
I'm Nasim Islami. I'm a PhD student at
Could you come
Anthropology
closer to the
department.
microphone, please? Yeah.
Yes. I'm Nasim, and I'm studying in Anthropology department. I'm focusing on Iranian immigrants in Southern California, mostly. You were talking about how to get people to be more involved and the lack of motivation. I would say that one thing we really need is that just give people more information, because many immigrants still, the ones came here, they're not citizens, they're not green card holders, they afraid a lot. I hear it a lot that, oh, if I get a speed ticket, they're gonna deport me. So I would say if they be aware of their own rights as residents, not citizens, they can be more active and feel more comfortable, because I think not knowing their own rights makes them to just back up and don't get involved with any of this.
Absolutely. No, this is a very good point, and I think the nonprofit community as well as the philanthropic community is trying to invest as much. So they call it Know Your Rights, right?
Yes.
Different cards in different ways. In fact, I don't know, Margarita, if you'd seen this, but there was a clip, I think, of NBC News trying to serve an enforcement action against someone, and this person stuck this Know Your Rights thing outside the window and did not open the door, right? Because there are rights that people have, right, regardless of your status, especially in terms of whether or not you allow people to enter your property without a warrant. So absolutely knowing your rights, but I think information beyond that. I mean, we've found this in our surveys of Asian Americans. Predominantly immigrant populations don't know as much about the parties, don't know as much about the issues. But instead of blaming them, traditionally we've had a role for political parties to try to educate, mobilize, and inform as many people as possible. But especially in a state like California, it's a lot of it is about ad spending and not as much about grassroots mobilization. And so that we need to rediscover. I think it's happening to some degree, the kind of people, going back to the grassroots, but I think there's still a long ways to go on that.
This is a moment for me to mention that when Californians say that immigrants are a benefit, I've asked a lot of questions that point in the direction of that immigrant groups are very broadly defined in California. For instance, there's very strong opposition to the travel ban, which was directed at the Muslim countries, and very strong opposition to the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. So Californians don't make those distinctions between, which immigrant groups should be favored or not. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll leave it at that because we're going to hear a lot from different community members and experts on what is happening locally, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Margarita Luna. I'm Senior Program Manager at the California Endowment. I oversee our Building Healthy Communities initiative in the Eastern Coachella Valley and manage our portfolio out here in the Inland Empire. And I have a panel of esteemed colleagues who are doing tremendous work in immigrant rights and research. And so we're going to have a conversation about what are the impacts that we're feeling with respect to immigration here in the Inland Empire. I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves first, and then we'll jump into a conversation. So I also want to say that I am a child of immigrants, so I think that's important for this conversation. So, Cecilia.
Good evening. My name is Cecilia Ayon, and I am an associate professor at the School of Public Policy, and I am the daughter of immigrants. Hello, my name is Luz Gallegos, Community Programs Director for Todec Legal Center, and I am an immigrant, and I'm also a granddaughter of a bracero and a daughter of farm workers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Murillo. I am an undocumented immigrant from here. I immigrated with my family along with my twin sister, but I'm also part of the Immigrant Youth, Inland Empire Immigrant Youth Collective since 2013. I've been organizing since my first year of college with them, so I highly identify with them. And I also recently graduated from UCR last June.
Hello, my name is Johnson Pham. I'm a senior at UCR, almost done. I'm also a student coordinator at the Asian Pacific Student Programs.
Maybe not. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I gotta kiss the mic, right? Sorry. So Cecilia, we're gonna start with you. I know that you've done a lot of research when you were in Arizona with respect to the impacts of immigration policies on immigrant individuals, families, and communities. So could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned?
Thank you, Margarita, for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm going to highlight 3 different issues. The first, starting with the impact on children. What we're seeing is that immigrant families are faced with a number of circumstances, and their children are having to process a lot of very difficult issues, like beyond what children should be asked to deal with at their age. So in the words of one mother, she said, children are losing their childhoods. So here are some examples of the types of things that they're having to contend with. So the first one would be chronic uncertainty and hypervigilance. So children worry and they stress about the deportability of their parents and other family members. They may also be faced with a number of critical incidents. And examples of critical incidents would include the detainment or deportation of a family member, but also experiences with discrimination, such as being called a derogatory term such as wetback by a peer, or being told by a neighbor that go back to your country. So these are some examples of the types of discrimination experiences, but also other forms of microaggressions. So these critical incidents often require parents to have a very difficult conversation with their children, and they may not actually be prepared to have some of these conversations. So for example, if a parent is detained, a child might ask, is my dad a criminal? And you can imagine how difficult this conversation is, because in the view of a child, only bad people are arrested, right? So then how do you talk to a 7, 8, 9-year-old about immigration policy? So this would be an area for further intervention, because often parents actually are not aware of how to talk about these issues with their parents, with their children. Some parents are equipped to deal with some of these issues, but we find that a lot of parents actually are not. A related issue is hyper-awareness of discrimination. So like I mentioned, children may experience discrimination directly, but they also experience discrimination indirectly. So if they see that their parents are being discriminated or that their peers are being treated unfairly, they're just very cognizant of discrimination when it occurs, and also of people being treated unfairly. So this mother, the notion of children without childhoods came from a mother who said her child was always bringing up these issues of how these things are unfair, how come this is happening? And she said, this is not what a niñez should be like, this is not what a childhood should be like. So then collectively you see that children are carrying this heavy weight or this burden, because not only because of the stressors they face, but also because they want to protect their parents and they want their families to be safe. Next, I want to discuss the impact of discrimination on parenting practices. And these are some early findings that we're having, but I wanted to mention them because I think they're pertinent to the discussion. So parents that experience high rates and multiple forms of discrimination tend to experience more challenges in their parenting. Specifically, they may engage in less monitoring or supervision and engage in less consistent disciplining strategies. So discrimination that emerges based on negative immigration rhetoric can take a toll on the parent-child interaction, where parents are less available. And I want to clarify this a little bit. So what we did in our analysis, we looked at parents and their levels, their reports of discrimination, and we grouped them into 4 groups. And then we did comparative analysis on the different parenting strategies based on these 4 groups, right? So one of the parenting outcomes that we looked at was warmth. So are they available to their children? Are they loving, caring, supportive? We saw no differences across the parents in that parenting outcome. Regardless of how much discrimination they experienced, they were all very loving, caring, and supportive. Where we did find a difference was the group that experienced the most discrimination, they tended to be less available for monitoring or supervision, and also engage in less consistent disciplining. And then the final issue that I wanted to highlight was around the toll that this is taking on health. So toxic stress associated with chronic uncertainty, hypervigilance, and discrimination places the health of this population at risk. There's already a substantial body of literature that links discrimination to poor health outcomes and poor mental health outcomes among ethnic minorities and immigrants in both children and adults. Also, among children whose parents have been deported, evidence suggests that they experience symptoms of trauma, PTSD, and anxiety. But I think an issue that we have to pay more attention to is what will be the long-term effects of anti-immigrant rhetoric and behaviors on immigrants' health. So what will the health of this population look like in the long term if we don't see a change? And this has a number of public health implications related to access to care and also availability. So I highlighted a few of the challenges that we see faced by immigrant families, but there's also a number of strengths that I think will come up through other panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's so important to think about toxic stress and the impacts of this heightened awareness of discrimination and just the fear that we are feeling and anxiety that we're feeling in our immigrant communities. And the impact that that has on their health is so important. I know that the Public Health Department in Riverside County has launched an initiative called Riverside Resilience, which is really focused on community trauma and how do we begin to prevent community trauma. And so just knowing how this is adding to what we're feeling in our communities is so important to acknowledge and understand. Luz, you've been in this fight for a long time. You know this firsthand in terms of the effects that it's having on folks that are coming into your offices. I really want you to help us put this into context. So what are the differences and similarities between sort of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we're feeling today versus in years and decades past, kind of similar to what Karthik set up in terms of how this has happened in the past here in California? How is this different, or how is this similar?
Yes, thank you, Margarita. Well, first of all, I want to come in as a, what I'm going to share today is coming firsthand as growing up here in the Inland Empire in our state of California, but also the history that was given to me by my grandfather that was part of the Bracero program, and gave us a lot of history of what happened in the past to a lot of our, not only our Mexican nationals, but immigrants at large. So this is coming from a very personal, but also family from experiences. So we know that nativist sentiments have always existed, and I'm talking about back in the 1930s when the Mexican repatriation, when the U.S. government rounded up not only U.S.-born citizens, but also undocumented folks and deported them back to their country. So this is not new. This is not new to our state. It's not new to our country, but it gives. I'm going to put a lot of context to what I'm going to share, and especially what's happening here in the Inland Empire. And right after that, in the 1940s, was the Bracero program, where a lot of your grandparents, grandfathers came to work in the fields between those years during World War II, when they needed a lot of farm workers, people to work in the railroads. So when they needed us, they called us. But then when they didn't need us, they sent us back. And that goes into Operation Wetback in the 1950s, when the U.S. government went after Mexican nationals that are undocumented, and they deported thousands of our Mexican nationals back to their country. So even in LA, cities like LA instigated a lot of this within their jurisdiction, and especially in the 1930s with the repatriation. And then years later, in 2005, we see how they stated to apologize on their actions and passed the Apology Act for 1930. So right now, what we're very hopeful with all this rhetoric and everything that is going on, that the same thing would happen years from now when they actually apologize to our undocumented community for criminalizing our community. So moving forward, this is where my personal perspective comes in, is the 1986 when IRCA, with the amnesty, with the Immigration Reform Control Act. I remember that's when Ppic was founded in 1984, because our founders were part of that think tank to mobilize and to create a solution for our immigration system that, as we were facing the same realities that our community is facing now, not only dealing with deportation, but labor rights and so many other issues that our community was going through. And I remember here in the Inland Empire, growing up here in the area where all these areas that we worked with were pure fields, and right here in Riverside we had all the citruses and all of that. And I myself was born in the United States, but to be honest, living in the reality that we lived then, I really thought I was undocumented. I didn't know I was legal until I was 13. Because we lived the same sentiments that our families lived. Oh, ahí viene la migra, here comes immigration. We only had, in Moreno Valley, back in the days, it was Sunnymead, we only had one phone. It was a phone booth. And my parents were organizers with the UFW, with Cesar, and they organized the first rapid response here when we only had one phone booth. Ahí viene la migra, they would go out and patrol the cities, and they would call into one of our good friends, Alfredo Gonzalez, it was La Mexicana. He would call, and we would call in. They would call in. Ya no está la migra para que anuncien. Ya no están los limones verdes. The green limes are not out. That was a passcode for people to go out and actually go out to the fields and work. So immigration's not new to the Inland Empire. I remember when we were organizing to mobilize our base, our members to DC. We were fundraising. Because we didn't have money to get to DC. So I remember we fundraised just enough money for many of us to fly to DC, but we didn't have enough money for a hotel. So we literally spent the night for a week under a bridge in Washington, DC, just so we could be advocating every day for a whole week and be putting pressure on our Congress, on our representatives to pass immigration reform. Why was it so important for us, and taking and uplifting our stories of why it was so important? And thanks to that effort, and not only us, but thousands of advocates across the nation, we were able to pass amnesty, which empowered over close to 3 million undocumented immigrants and get their status either by time or if they work in the fields. So since then, our organization, we're very blessed that our founders really concentrated in civic engagement, because right away we started organizing, mobilizing, making sure that our community had their legal status. So in filing their paperwork, making sure they learned English and the history, everything that they needed to be able to acquire this immigration relief. And since then, right away when they were able to get their status, their legal permanent status, we mobilized them to become U.S. citizens. Because our founders knew that whatever we could shout, we could do whatever we want, but what's going to take us or it's going to take our community to the reality that we're living now here in the state of California is our vote. Since then, the organization has helped over 100,000 immigrants in the Inland Empire, and it's growing, to become U.S. citizens and be civically engaged. So we're very proud of that effort, because one way or another, the Inland Empire has leveraged a lot of the state bills that have passed in California. I remember when Prop 180, in 1994, that's when NAFTA hit in the Inland Empire. In a lot of our fields, a lot of our members, they were affected by NAFTA because that's when the U.S. opens the border in Mexico. A lot of our farm owners went across the border because it was cheaper labor. So we were left with dislocated workers. Our organization filed a class action lawsuit, and we won, and we were able to get some relief for these workers. So these are impacts that have happened here in the IE, especially here in the Riverside and San Bernardino County. Right after that, in 1994, the voters of the state of California passed Proposition 187. So it was the actual voters. I remember we were organizing around this, and with a lot of organizations across the state. And I remember we started in Central Valley. We started a march, and we marched all the way to Sacramento. And we would start creating songs. And I'm going to sing you guys a little song. It's in Spanish, so we'll translate it later, but hope you guys understand. Judíos y afroamericanos se han unido a una coalición de diferentes organizaciones, sacaremos al viejo sesentón. And you guys know who that was. That was Pete Wilson. All right? So it took a lot of effort, but a grassroots effort we sent this off to the U.S. courts, and we won because this was an unconstitutional law. So ever since then, a lot of us, a lot of youth, got activated the same way we're seeing now, because right now we're in a different reality, because back then it wasn't cool to be a organization that served immigrants. It was a few of us here. Now we see a lot of organizations are coming up and stepping up for the community, so that's very enlightening. Right, and that we, just like the Professor Carthwick said, Proposition 209, Proposition 227, and then here in the Inland Empire, now we come up to 2010, SB 1070, Arizona bill. That's when because since a child, I saw a lot of discrimination, I saw a lot of hate. I know my parents used to say that there was a sign that said, no negros, no perros, no Mexicanos, when they came, that no blacks, no Africans, no dogs were allowed in certain places. But a lot has changed since then. I know with SB 1070, what we've seen is that it was a door that opened for a lot of these anti-immigrant sentiments to come out. And I think that really was the beginning, because we started seeing how different groups like the Minutemen come out and so forth, and started being really vocal and more visible. But and then that comes out, and that passed. But in 2010, what happens? In 2011, we started organizing, not only our organization, but a lot of organizations, a lot of compañeros that are here today. We started organizing to, as we were doing the legislative and congressional redistricting that happened here, we were mobilizing our base to the commission meetings. Every single commission we were mobilizing, because TODEC is a regional organization, so if they were in San Bernardino, we would mobilize to San Bernardino, wherever they were at, to make sure that the maps that we were supporting were approved, because we knew that we had to make sure our districts, our communities alike, we had the political power, because we have been building the citizenship, the civic engagement, but now we needed to redistrict. And thanks to that effort, I remember one of the last meetings that we attended, a man comes out, and we were leaving, because we were taking our members back, and he comes out and he tells my mother in Spanish, because he tells them, "Thank you for coming, because we've seen you guys with different people from your organization at different meetings, and because of your mobilization and everything we saw there, we're gonna respect your maps." So the maps that we presented, along with a lot of compañeros that worked very hard, that were approved. And now we see a different reality. We see in 2012, the elections come. And now, what do we have? Representation not only at the local level, at the state, at the federal level, but that took decades. That took decades to plan, to organize, to mobilize from the grassroots, to create that consciousness. Although I'm hearing the numbers that were given, that we have such a low percentage of turnout, but believe me, back in the days, we didn't have crap, you know? So we have come a long way in the Inland Empire, and that took a lot of organizing, a lot of effort. And without any resources, our resources were our people. We are powered by our people. We are powered by our base. Now we're very lucky to have Margarita Luna that's in the ground, that's seeing the work, that's being supportive of the work of many of our organizations. But back in the day, we didn't have crap. You know, and we did it because of our passion, because we knew it was the right thing to do. And thanks to those efforts, you know, we live a different reality here in the Inland Empire. To tell you that we have grown our political power and our presence, that in 2013, our Riverside County Board of Supervisors passed. We asked for a support for a resolution to support an immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship. And thanks to our rest in peace, our supervisor, John Benoit from the Coachella Valley, and our current supervisor from my district, Marion Ashley, that stepped up and presented, and we mobilized to put pressure, and it passed anonymously. And they say Riverside County is a conservative county, but you know what? It's about the person. We as nonprofits, we are nonpartisan, and we cannot vote for parties or color or last names. We have to go out and make sure that the people we're putting in power represent our values and the issues, because we need to be competitive, because they need to compete for our vote. If there's no competition, they go, we already have them, we already have their vote. So, you know, a lot of things have happened since then. You know, we had anonymous vote, and they not only passed it, but they actually flew it to DC and presented it. That shows that they're listening and they're paying attention to us, that they know we're building this big political power, and we're not going to stop now because things are getting good. Things are getting very good, that we see more communities stepping up, and we're going to continue. We have all of you youth. We have a lot of youth within our youth teams that we organize with all the kids with conscience. Our kids now are seeing what they're doing to their parents, and believe me, those kids are going to vote when they turn 18. And we have a lot of hope, not only for the Inland Empire, but for the state of California and our nation. And this has leveraged the work in the Inland Empire has really leveraged the state of California, as we see how California is stepping up for the immigrant community. In DACA, we saw how DACA just passed, but there is life after DACA, especially here in the state of California, when we just passed SB 54, and we have passed so many pro-immigrant laws here in the state. It took us, I remember in 1998, when we were working with Gil Cedillo to pass the driver's license law in California, it took us until 2013 until we had build that power of people that were in that power in the seat to actually vote in favor and pass, and with Jerry Brown signing it. So we are in a good space. We invite you to continue to be civically engaged. That is the power that we have as immigrants, because that is the voice, and that's the loudest voice we could have. All of you youth, if you haven't registered to vote, make sure you register to vote. Thank you.
Yeah, give it up. As you can see, Luz is a force to be reckoned with, right? On her own. Not to mention the many volunteers that make up Ppic Legal Center. You know, the work that you've done, Luz, and the work that other immigration advocates have done have really inspired a lot of young people to take up their own leadership, right? They're not sort of the change makers of tomorrow, they're change makers today. And so I want to introduce DNA, who is the community engagement coordinator for the Inland Empire Immigrant Youth Collective, which, you know, is a grassroots organizing group that was born out of the DACA debate many years ago. And so, DNA, what can you tell us about the impact of current immigration policies on immigrant youth and their families here in the IE?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'll retract just a little bit before I dive into what's happening now with the IIYC for short. So the IIYC was first established in 2010. So this collective of undocumented youth directly affected by the situation in the IE without DACA, without the state financial aid, encourage like folks to build a space where undocumented youth can feel safe to come together and organize, but also talk about, yes, immigration status was a big one, but there's also intersections of our gender, being a woman and being undocumented woman, but also being part of our membership. Our founders were identified as queer and undocumented. So building that safe space of organizing, but respecting the complex identities that we each have. So yes, we've been around before DACA and before the California Dream Act. So our membership has been in all walks of having to navigate the higher education system without having a work permit or having a state financial aid help us navigate it. But we also have youth that are getting involved currently that are in middle school or in high school, and how do we connect those generations so that now that we're in a similar situation with no working permit after they expire, how can we connect them and let them know that there is, like you were saying, life after DACA, there is possibility with all the state legislation that's been passing throughout the years. So just currently, I know I was tasked to answer, like, what are the current impacts of undocumented immigrants, the youth and their families. Just working with youth, we work directly with undocumented youth, but we're also working with their families. Not because we're a youth organization, we don't work on legislation that impacts the undocumented adults in the state. We heavily work on that too. And right now, what we see a lot in our people coming to our org and calling us, Facebooking us, because there's a lot of confusion on the impacts. There's a lot of confusion. The fact that DACA was recently rescinded, there's a lot of confusion when it comes to, like, well, am I able to apply to state financial aid? Am I able to work? Because a lot of this youth are growing with DACA. People applied back when they were 15 and they're still in high school, and now coming out of high school. And with the recent announcement, there's a lot of confusion. So I think there's a lot of need of education, but also making them be involved, as we are part service providers, but we also link it with having those youth get involved and become leaders. And one of the examples that we've been trying to push a lot is our Undocumented Mentorship Academy program that we launched this past summer, basically having youth know their rights, also educating them on state legislation and how can they be involved, and also do district visits or travel to Sacramento or DC and be their own advocates. So empowering them a lot during this time has been what we have focused on, but education most of the time. And yes, starting like early this year, IIYC's membership has increased. And it's a good thing. It's a place we're in a place of opportunity where we can, as people are coming to our organization, either allies, but also people directly affected. It's really important for us to use this time and opportunity to get them involved. And more than that, I know IOAC is known for doing direct actions, protests, marches, and speaking our minds, but it's very important for us to give them the reason why the reasoning behind why are we doing such thing, why are we targeting our local sheriff from San Bernardino, who goes out in Sacramento and is very vocal against SB 54. Why is it important for us to protest and do such banner targeting him? So it's been a place of opportunity, very engaging, but we're also giving that space for youth to have time to talk and just share, what are you feeling? Feeling angry, feeling worried, feeling confused. And a lot of the times the youth that are coming in with us, they're like, this is the first time that I'm able to talk about this. And for us, it's like, for me that I've been part of the IIYC since 2013, for me it's something normal to talk about my undocumented identity, but some youth is like something that they only talk about it at home, but they haven't done that with someone around their age. So it's pretty cool to empower other youth and tell them there's a lot of place of opportunity and a lot that we can do, although there's no DACA, but education with it along with that. And I know our previous panelists talked about the health impacts, like of stress on youth and their parents, and we've seen that just the fact that parents are seeing how their youth are coming to them, like, what are we going to do after DACA? I don't have a work permit. And we've seen how examples of parents, how this has directly affected their physical and emotional health. So definitely just being there for them has been a big part of it. I know you wanted me to touch upon what is my point of hope, because I know I'm talking just about like the distress, the anxiety, the confusion that there is, but there is a point of hope. And when you asked me to share about that, for me was, well, back in 2011, recently graduated out of high school. My first year of college, I was not with the IOIC, but then eventually I joined the IOIC. I felt like there's no hope for me as a student who was aspiring to finish their higher education, but meeting IOIC, I was empowered. Before I was like the quietest person in the room. I would never speak in front of people, especially about who I am, being undocumented, sharing our stories, just being part of this organization and taking spaces where other times I wouldn't imagine being part of. It's what gives me hope, having other youth have this place and sharing their stories and encouraging other youth to get involved and knowing that there's a lot they can do from their end. Setting up visits with their local legislators, with their Congress people, their assembly members, pressuring them to push legislation can be very empowering. Over the years doing this work allowed me to be more vocal about issues that directly affect my family and myself. And just knowing that I have that to hand over to other youth is my point of hope for this time, that although there's no DACA, there's legislation out there that we can tell you about, but there's also the part where they can also do something and get involved. So I'm really happy to know that the IOAC's membership's growing. So that's our point of work at the moment. And just one last thing, going based on like what Luz was saying, it's like just looking at the work that has been done before. Some of us came in from the IOIC and looking into the future, a lot of what I see is like the fact of coalition building, working in collectives out here in the IE has been very powerful. I mean, I don't think the IOAC can cover the entire turf of San Bernardino and Riverside County, but being part of coalitions helps because either we can be part of the inland coalitions for immigrant justice, for example, and working together collectively, coordinating each other to press on statewide campaigns or federal campaigns. That's another point of hope where we can, as people that want to get involved, be civically involved, you can join a coalition and see how you can work together with other people and not like reinvent the wheel, but work with people that have been doing similar work already. So yes, thank you.
That's great.
Thank you, DNA. So Johnson, as a student and ally here at UCR, I'm curious about, what are the other ways that we see these immigration policies just impacting our communities much more generally here in the IE?
Right. So first off, I do want to affirm with my other panelists that I'm also the child of refugees. My parents, immigrants. Specifically, my parents are Vietnamese refugees. So when we talk about how immigration affects student communities, I think it's important to really highlight who immigrants are, right? So when we talk about immigrants in the campus community, we also include workers, students, student parents, teachers' assistants, faculty, staff, clerical workers. Professor Carthrick kind of touched upon this, that immigration and policies and issues are very heavily racialized, and we can't deny that fact. So with that in mind, I also do think that anti-immigration policies are also very racist, also anti-women, anti-queer, anti-trans, and they encapsulate a lot of hateful values that hopefully we want to combat. So I kind of broke this up in a few components, right? So also building back of what Cecilia had mentioned about hypervigilance, I personally feel that, and I think it's important to talk about that with respect to student wellness. When I talk about student wellness, I'm talking about things that a lot of students go through, but student immigrants suffer through more, right? Like, it isn't a secret that UC Riverside, among all UC campuses, a lot of students are food insecure. That's the reality. When we talk about student wellness and how this affects immigration policies affect our students, we need to consider mental health and how, graduate students and undergraduate students are need a lot of, resources and facilities to support mental wellness. We also need to address housing, childcare, healthcare, all of that. We need to when we talk about our students here doing okay, we need to make sure that every single student, immigrant students and undocumented students all have access to all these different things. That's how you become a successful student, when you don't have to worry about when am I going to eat, where am I going to sleep. Some of the panelists also talked about this point of political action. I think the university is a critical juncture for a lot of things, right? I really resonated with your story. I think, a few years ago, I was a queer homeless youth, living on the street, and here I am on a panel. I think the university provides a lot of opportunity for us to grow and develop our politics, and as well as learn from each other. I'm kind of nervous and very asking some other hard being why I was asked to speak last. How do I follow up this? But I think there's a really good learning point, and I think one thing that we need to work on for our community on this campus is how do we politically educate and mobilize students? It's one thing to learn from a textbook, but how do we apply that into our communities, and how do we build power? Moving on from just student organizing and student communities, but how do we, as the UC Riverside student community, also become embedded and entrenched in the Inland Empire community? One thing that was also mentioned before was this, culture of fear. When the immigration policy about DACA was coming out, for most of the folks that I talked to, it wasn't that big of a surprise. It was like a growing crescendo, ever since the onset of this new administration. Because of that, there is this hypervigilance, there's also this culture of fear. With that comes a lot of misinformation. With that comes a lot of what can I do, what can't I do? It's important and it's crucial for us to be aware of our limits, but also the ways in which that people who have more privilege, specifically people with documentation, can support undocumented folks. I also do want to highlight a recent incident that happened in UC Riverside on this campus, where, a student, a queer femme, she was, she did an action against someone who was very obviously trying to instigate folks with a Make America Great Again hat. It was obviously to instigate, the campus and the space they were in, because most of us are immigrants or, have that type of background. I think when we talk about what students need and the culture on campus, we need to hold administration accountable, and we need to make sure that everyone here feels secure and that they can willingly come to campus and not fear for their lives. And sometimes that's a literal thing, because the student in particular, because of her actions, there was a viral video that was posted and reposted on Fox News, on alt-right news media. It gathered over millions of views. She was harassed, she was attacked, she had her address doxxed. And not too long ago, a group of students came together and were like, what is the university going to do about this? When we talk about things that immigrant communities need, we need to make sure that we're holding people with power accountable. Because the other panelists have mentioned, when we fight, we win, but we also stronghold on that. I do want to highlight a few things on campus that I think are really great and have addressed some of these needs and concerns that I've talked about. With student hunger, I want to highlight the food pantry, which provides groceries for students who are food insecure. I think SNAPs for them. I think they're a really great resource. As well as on campus, we have the undocumented student programs. And the person in charge of it is a UCR alum who's a friend, a colleague, and they provide so much for the community, I think, in terms of legal and community referrals, in terms of leadership opportunities, in terms of scholarships, in terms of like just making sure people are okay. And I guess I do want to, like, as a student myself, I'm affected by all these things, right? And I think the most important thing to take away is, or that what gives me hope really is, I have seen like how student power and student mobilization has been effective. Giving more sense of my background, in the past I chaired the first diversity council at UCR, where these needs that were granted, like the food pantry or the student programs, these were not given as a concession by the university because they were like, oh yeah, like cool, like we did this for you. No, it was because students mobilized and we were like, this is what we need. You need to provide it or we're gonna like raise hell. That's how things get done, right? So that's exactly what we did. And it's because I've seen it happen, the literal grassroots mobilization move from bottom top, raising hell for all the people at the top. I've seen it happen, I've seen it occur, I've seen people grow, I've seen it work. So I believe in it, and that's why I believe that we will win. That's, yeah.
Awesome. I don't know where my time person is, but I think in the interest of time, that's exactly what I was going to do. Yeah, so we're in between you and the food. So let's. I don't want people to get hangry. So how about some questions for our esteemed panelists? Yes, please step to the mic. Yeah, sure. So if there's another person that'd like to,
Okay.
we'll collect the questions and then we'll have the
Mine is-
panelists answer.
Hello, hello. Okay. Mine is the comment and a question. So I was one of those students that, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was helping with, 2000 AB 540. So I went to school through AB 540 way before DACA, graduated from UCR, and was the president of Poder, providing opportunities and dreams in education in Riverside here at this campus for about 3 years. And I'm one of the students that initiated the conversations here with the UCR administration in addressing how they were falling behind as an institution for not having undocumented student programs, and now we have undocumented student programs, although I'm not here anymore, but it's okay, right? And I just wanted to say that now, being the spokesperson through Poder or Chicano student programs, back then, and I was interviewed when, DACA, with the announcement was given, and when the memo was given on June 12th, of 2012, and responded to that, went to Telemundo, started, telling people this is what you need to have to apply, for this benefit, and just seeing the whole change, from back 2000 all the way to now. Although I haven't been working with, in political engagement, in this area now, as much as I used to in the past. I just want to say that it's a place where we have a lot of momentum. So I know most of you have said, we are in a good place. We're in California. We're progressive. We're protective of what we already have. And I just want to, commend you for the work that you're doing, and for the students that are here. That there's always an opportunity to engage, to do something, to protect, your fellow classmates and families and friends. In this community that may be affected by this situation. So that was my comment, and my question is, what are some of the tips in terms of engagement? And I know we've mentioned a few different ones as it comes to, as it relates to UCR students, because I think that's where the best or the biggest benefit will be under this space for UCR students in general.
Thank you so much.
you.
So let's hear the next question, and then Lucy can jump on it.
Hello, my name is Delilah. I know some of you on the panel, and first of all, also a comment. I just want to thank you all for being here today, for all the information that you shared, and our past panelists. And also thank you to the previous person that spoke, because I was that generation that came afterwards, right? So I came to UCR thinking that I was going to have to take time off or figure out how on earth I was going to get through college, because I didn't know funding was going to be available. And it just happened to be that the year that I started university, the policies came into place so that everything would work out. And it was kind of like this magical moment, but I recognized that it wasn't magical. You know, it was really the work of all these people that put their lives at risk, that put their stories at risk. And so I kind of have a two-part question, because obviously, like being DACA, I want to protect myself and others that are in the situation and share my story. But I'm also worried about how do we integrate the stories of other immigrants that don't fit quite into the DACA narrative, and make sure that we don't have to trade off, you know, protecting the work permits in exchange for policies that are really going to affect our parents or older immigrants that didn't qualify quite for DACA or that have other types of records. How do we keep telling our stories and keep pushing this forward, but also not hurt them? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we have wisdom here to share.
As far for the, thank you for the comment del compañero, I forgot your name, but you're awesome. It's very important to be engaged. I know for us, within our organization, I got engaged. I was born into the movement because my parents were organizers, but we see all our youth that that are part of the organization, how, you know, we're creating this leadership pipeline of these advocates, of these leaders that they know they're living the issues, so they're making sure that their issues are, that they're part of the table, that their stories are continuing to be uplifted. So right now, more than ever, engagement is very crucial. You know, there's a lot of our organizations that invite you in and with our, you know, open arms, and it's a matter of fit. But it's very important to stay engaged. In any way that you could stay engaged, by either by elevating your stories. I think the stories have really helped us. Just going back to IRCA with the amnesty, that's how we were able to convince all these legislators that we needed an immigration relief. So even to now in California, how we continue to push progressive bills and so forth. So, you know, I am very hopeful, and I am very thankful, because many people that came before us, we're going through some tough times right now with hate and all of that, but it's not new. It's not new. We're in a better position now than when we were back when I was a child. And I think we all should ride on that, and we should all stay united, and we need to stay organized. And most of all, it's important to continue elevating the stories and not to be scared. Because trust me, we as organizers and advocates here, and some of you out there, we're putting our lives on the line. And hate is real. I am bolded today to share with you my story that I haven't shared it publicly. What I've seen from the back in the days as I was growing up, that hate was always disguised, right? We heard about the KKK movement, that they were gathered in their spaces with their caps on, and we didn't know who they were. But now, ever since, not only now, but ever since SB 1070, we have seen how these people are emboldened to not only to talk, because we're used to death threats, we're used to threats, we're used to it. You know, and we're not scared, and we're not going to let terror take over us. But now when they're actually what they feel empowered by this current administration to act on it, for me, that's the biggest thing. Because I'm used to immigration trends, and we know how to strategize, and we know how to be intentional so we could get our work done and how our end goals could be met. But what me as an organizer is, I got targeted twice this year. I got shot at, my car got shot at. And this is the first time I'm coming out publicly, because I didn't want to come out, because I didn't want to scare community, because we want to protect our community. But you know what? Hate is real. And that's why us more than ever, we have to stay vocal, we have to stay united, and we have to stay organized. We thought it was just vandalism, but 3 months ago, my car, they broke all the windows of my car, they put Nazi signs all over it, and now they know where I live. Hate is real. But this is not gonna stop me, it's not gonna stop any of us to stay quiet. Now more than ever, we have to stay loud over our priorities, and we cannot let terror take over us, because terrorism, our country is against terrorism, but what's happening now, that they're trying to create terror amongst our communities, and we will not stand for it. We will not stand for it.
calling. Thank you for calling hate speech and this, you know, it's anti-immigrant sentiment, but it's more than a sentiment, right? I mean, these are actions, right? So thank you for calling it out for terrorism for what it really is. You know, it is terrorizing our communities, absolutely. And I'm sorry for that happening to you, Luz. I did want to ask the NA to talk a little bit about the ways that you know, students here at UCR can get engaged in, you know, civic engagement. What are the various ways for them to be engaged in this work? And then also, if you can answer questions about, you know, the whole dreamer. You know, we had a conversation about this, and I'd love for you to address that a little bit.
Okay. So I'll first talk about how to get involved, and just know that as a student, a lot of us have to do like all the schoolwork and all that, but just know that organizing and doing schoolwork go hand in hand. If you're doing like, I was a sociology major, and me being involved with IOAC enhanced like everything I was learning. It was not just like book smart, but it was like putting it into practice in the community, and it just builds your passion for what you're learning in class, and it helps you, in other words. But there's ways you can get involved. I know through ICIJ, IOAC, the many organizations out there, you can intern for them. I know you look into internships for credits for units out here. You can intern or just volunteer with us. Like if you message us, we would follow up with you. If you want to attend your first march, your first vigil out in Adelanto, or you want to just get involved, reach out to the organizations. A lot of us are overwhelmed with the work, and we would need volunteers, and a lot of y'all are good with research, are good with finding stuff. We need you in the community to help us, but just know that a lot of what you're taking in as an intern, you're learning a lot from the people you're working with, so you're taking a lot of learning experience by just interning on your community. So if you want to get involved, I know you can do internships, and even though we might not be on the list, reach out to the organizations ourselves, and we can make it work. I know we have worked with Pitzer students, not so much UCR students, so please reach out to us if you want to intern with us. Reach out to the orgs, not because we're not on the list, it's limited to. Build that relationship with us, because honestly, the organizations out here do need the support and need the hands, and because you're good with research, you're more than welcome to help us with that too. And about the whole dreamer narrative and how we cannot throw people under the bus, continue to doing that to our own parents, correct? I know as IOAC, we're intentionally supporting the Federal DREAM Act, but being very strong and vocal about our messaging behind that, we're not buying into the whole dreamer. First of all, at a personal level, I don't identify as a dreamer, and I say why with the intention of educating others. I am undocumented. I am not a dreamer. I am not deserving of being accepted in this society, and educating them why. We live in a region where we have CBP, ICE, and then you have your sheriffs that interact with CBP. So it's a mess out here in the IE. And knowing that if we support a bill that's going to further militarize this region, it's going to affect our parents going to their jobs. It's going to affect people's daily lives, our undocumented adults in this region. So it's very important that if we are going to support certain legislation, that we are very vocal of educating why we're not abiding by that dreamer narrative, like, oh, I came here, but it was not my fault. It's really important. Education right now is very crucial to include people and tell them why. What's the reasoning behind? And because a lot of folks maybe have not encountered, like, why are people not going by the dreamer narrative? It's not that we're trying to cause that division. It's because we want to include other people that might not benefit by it now, but in the future, let's stop antagonizing other people and dividing ourselves. Yeah. So just being very clear about it. And if you want to intern with IOAC, please let me know after.
Well, I know there's a lot more that we can talk about, that we should.
Let's talk over food.